Hello and welcome to 60 Minutes or Less, a podcast from Birthday Cake for Breakfast. I'm Andy Hughes and it's a quick intro for episode 33 as we wanted to get every last second out of our guest, Jon King of the legendary Gang of Four. His memoir, To Hell with Poverty, a class act inside the Gang of Four, is out now via Constable. For more on the book, the podcast and Gang of Four, check out the show notes. Right, enjoy. It did seem like the US was kind of like the dreamland compared to 70s Britain at that point. It must have been such a jump.
Yeah, it was, I think, more in the 60s when I was because Britain was so awful. I mean, it's hard to it's hard to sort of describe it without being like someone off Monty Python, really. I mean, I actually played on a bomb site. It wasn't till the 60s that bomb sites were cleared and then turned into well, all the major car parking space in London were bomb sites. So if you're ever in one of those things, that's where a bomb destroyed the whole block normally, and it was terrible. I mean, really terrible. My family all came from, on my mother's side, from Islington and that area, which was appalling. I mean, now it's really posh and then bourgeois. Then it was just ruinous slums, and yeah. I read a book of history about the 1950s and 60s. It said that around 40% of all British adults were considering emigrating in the 1950s. 40% were wanted to emigrate. So when people talk about the good old days, I'm not quite sure when they're talking about, but it wasn't.
Well, it's people have like, when they say what era would you like to grow up in, and people say the 60s and 70s. I imagine for people like yourself who were actually there, it was a lot more shitter than, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you cherry pick it, if you said, "Oh yes, I'd like to be in the 60s, but basically I'd like to be quite well off or properly well off, living in or near St John's Wood or Carnaby Street and hanging out with Gene Shrimpton and a load of really attractive young men and women in the theatre and all that." Yeah, that would be really great play. That would have been a great time. But actually that wasn't the time for 99% of the population. My dad was an electrician in the time when electricians didn't get paid very much. My mum was a housewife, and that's what she would have called herself. And the opportunities for working class people and women was sort of pretty non-existent. I think these are well, the caveat is right at the moment things are pretty grim feeling, but I think things are way better now than they were then, and it's only creepy old people go on about that. And basically, what they mean is they want people to do as they say. They just want people to be as miserable as they were.
Yeah, condensation on the windows and stuff like that.
Marvelous. I mean, I remember all that stuff. We didn't have any central heating. We didn't have an inside toilet. We didn't have a bathroom in the house. All that, all that stuff. It's quite comical, really, but it wasn't nice. Yeah.
Yeah, very, very Beano, which again, something from the book that, I reveled in the fact that you had all this stuff about liking, the comics and stuff like that. But we will get to the book and, everything else. But at the minute you're gearing up for the final Gang of Four tour.
Yes.
That was quite a mouthful. So how is gearing up for tour now different to way back when, other than having, everyone actually turn up for the rehearsal?
Well, that actually was quite a challenge in the olden days, getting Dave and Andy to turn up for a rehearsal and then hang around long enough to actually rehearse. When we started, like with all bands, we didn't have any money. No, we just didn't have any money at all, and there was no one we could borrow money from, and we weren't being paid very much. And so right at the beginning, there weren't really any tours at all to speak of. I mean, we lived in slums in Leeds, and we phoned up and we got support shows. And if we were lucky, we could go along and support a band like Eater, a sort of proto-punk rock band, and you'd be paid £10, and then you'd be told by the band you have to give them £10 to use their PA system. So you'd end up with nothing. I mean, when we supported, we were doing quite well, and it was Paul Weller's dad, phoned us up, and tickets weren't selling for his gig in Camden, which now the I can't remember what to call it, halfway up Camden High Street, and they weren't selling well, and we were quite hot as a live act. He said, "Oh, come down, I'll see you right." And we drove all the way down from Leeds, and probably about a third of the people in the audience were there to see us and not the Jam. And he gave us a tenner, £10 to drive from Leeds to London, which wouldn't have covered a round of sandwiches. So now you talk about the contrast. The contrast now is we got some juice, so we don't get messed about like that. You know where you are. The other thing is you do become quite good at what you do, and you're learning your craft. And I mean, I know what I need to do for me to get together, and I appreciate the skills of the other people. I got back from the States last Wednesday. I went out for a week to rehearse, or 5 days, and Gail Greenwood, who is our bass player for this final tour, she's the bass player Belly. She's fantastic. She's the only one member of the band who's been on the front cover of Rolling Stone. She really knows her stuff. And then there's Ted Leo, who's played with every fantastic punk rock and hardcore and skillful band. He plays with Amy Mann every year on tour with her. So when you play with someone as good as that, it's great because they bring a different flavour to it. I mean, I was listening to him playing Anthrax, and he's a great, like everyone reveres what Andy Gill did, when he made his music, as do I. So you don't want to be like a stars in your eyes thing, but you want it to be about a real thing now that thrills now audiences, because the majority of our audience in America are under the age of 35. It's not old ball blokes. And to hear someone who's got a great technical arsenal approaching an untechnical way of playing, because Andy had no technical skills at all, really, but had this amazing imagination. And it's great, and it's thrilling to watch that happening. And of course, there's me and Hugo still there, with two of the three original founders of the band. And Hugo's got more and more like Charlie Watts and more like solid metronomic happening thing. And with Gail, it's a thrill. So the contrast, I suppose, is just I spend a lot of time looking at the others, thinking, oh, they're really good. And also we're playing two sets. We're going to play the whole of Entertainment track by track, which is quite a trip, really, in that a number of the songs on that we almost never play. In fact, so I have almost never ever played live for different reasons. But a song that we have now nailed, Guns Before Butter, which is on Entertainment. And I sit there thinking, oh, that could be written now about all this stuff.
Yeah.
I hear some talk about blood and iron. That's the cause of all my. And I think it's terrible that is relevant. It's terrible that is a relevant song now. And then in the second set, which is all the best of the rest, it's all like In the Ditch, which is a song I wrote when I'd received the advice in the event of a nuclear attack on Leeds. Every household got sent a pamphlet called Leeds and the Bomb. And it was like, which I referred to in the book, but if a 1 megaton bomb exploded over Leeds Town Hall, and it showed you the destruction and whether you'll die or survive or linger and then die. And I was really pleased that I was right in the middle of the blast area. But the advice was, if you're outdoors, dive in a ditch and cover your eyes, which is the advice I was given when I was 5 years old, when I was doing duck and cover exercises against the nuclear war everyone believed was happening. Then when I was 20, we get sent these pamphlets saying, in the event of a nuclear war, get under a table and cover your eyes. And now I read last week, the French government are sending around a version of this pamphlet to every household in France. I mean, man, it's terrible. So getting it together, I'm very pleased, and it is the right time to stop doing it, but it's kind of a time when it still makes sense.
Just thinking about, I've read a few interviews, about the book and stuff, and I liked seeing that on occasion you've held up a copy of this pamphlet to the person, who's interviewing. And I quite like that, that it's still there, this tatty copy. That whole, France doing it now currently, there was that thing where text messages were accidentally sent to people the once about saying there's going to be a nuclear attack, which is crazy. It is something in the book that occurs again and again and again in terms of the bomb being, a big thing. Does it seem mad to you that it is still something that can strike fear? Maybe not so much now, or at least not anywhere that's not France, but that's still something that's so prevalent.
Well, it is. I mean, I feel like lots of people quite anxious about it. I mean, the Polish government 2 weeks ago was trying to egg on the American government to place nuclear missiles in Poland. It is a recurrent thing, and it's something that is strange, really, that it's even part of the vocabulary of these discussions, And thinking again of the music, when I wrote the words to Essence Rare, there's a line in it, she doesn't think so, but she's dressed for the H bomb because she's wearing a bikini. And, the Bikini Atoll was where the Americans were testing their H bombs, destroying completely this idyllic island. And then this bloke comes out with the design for a skimpy two-piece swimsuit and says it's the most shocking thing, even more shocking than the H bomb. And yet that hangs over our heads in a strange way. I suppose human beings have always had this anxiety about the end of the world, but that happens to have been through my whole life, seeing that. And as a little boy, as I could say, playing on a bomb site, which I really enjoyed. I mean, it was a really good bomb site. The whole house of next door to my granny's, it was just an exact circular hole from the roof all the way through to top to bottom. It was like it'd been cut out again, like a Beano cartoon. And I thought it was great. But I'm assuming they removed the bomb at the bottom.
You'd certainly hope so, yeah. On the Beano as well, I love that line you said about the one pressing matter that you had as a child, other than, being terrified of the bomb, was whether there was going to be a post-apocalyptic themed version of the Beano, which I thought was a great line.
Yeah, I mean, think of, was it thingy Lord Snooty and his pals? Actually, I suppose we've been living through Lord Snooty and his pals over the last 14 years of the Conservative government, haven't we?
Well, quite. There's a literal one that was in Parliament, wasn't there? Yeah.
There was.
But it's not just, the bomb, but one of the most depressing things is that while so much has changed, so much remains the same. And that, from women's rights to what the haves and have-nots have and constant conflict and such. Does it feel to you that, I appreciate, obviously the word depressing, definitely, but does it feel that that is possibly one of the reasons to look at it from a different angle, why Gang of Four maybe remains so influential to contemporary artists and such, given that these things that you touched upon way back when and then through the life of Gang of Four still remain so relevant, even though it's unfortunate that it does?
With all of the, I tried to approach this with a light touch, but I was always very serious about what we were doing. And I didn't want to do something that was just a passing thing. Like if you hear old people who are all a pain in the arse, but and they always think music was great in the olden days and it isn't anymore, which isn't so. But I think that the things that persist, and that's why I think people still get something out of what we've done, is we were really serious about it. And it's obvious that what we were doing was not about making money. I mean, it's not commercial music. I wasn't trying not to make money. I would have been delighted if it had been. But I think it's not jazz, but I think of it kind of like jazz music. I think we did it because we felt we had to. And the things that I wanted to write about and did write about were the things that I cared about and talked about with my friends and people that I respected. When you're in the pub, you don't always talk about getting your leg over and getting smashed, all that stuff. Although sometimes that's a really good conversation to have. You talk about, I mean, like at the moment, the world conversations are dominated by what's going on in America, what's going on in Ukraine and the like. Those are the things that are there. And obviously you don't want to be a newspaper. You're not there to necessarily, well, a lot of reggae music used to be a bit like a newspaper, but you write about things that you feel very strongly about. When I lived in Leeds, which is a place I love being in because it was so cosmopolitan and so different to my upbringing. All around, I mean, we lived in a city which was had the worst serial killer in British history. I have to say, I didn't feel I was entitled to at the time. I can't think of a single artist who has written a song about that who lived in Leeds and Yorkshire. Or you see in literature like David Peace writing in the Red Riding Quartet about the corruption and incompetence and misogyny of the police. And I felt, without wanting to be, I didn't want to be miserabilist about it, but wanted to say, what's it like to live in a place like that? And I was part of Rock Against Racism. We were part of Rock Against Racism. I mean, we've seen Black Lives Matter happen in America, and we've seen all sorts of terrible things, like that a police officer murdering a young woman in London, and then attacking the demonstrators who weren't even demonstrating, attacking the people holding young women holding candles, who were traumatized. And I think that's why people listen to Gang of Four. Not because there's not stuff going on, although I'm not really aware necessarily of what might be going on there. But there's very little going on that says, what about Sarah Everard? What about, the abuses that's going on? One of the songs in America, particularly, that goes down really a storm is "It's Her Factory," which is the flip side of one of the singles, where Hugo stands up and sings. I play melodica, and we change it every time that we play it to what's going on in the immediate vicinity, attacking women's rights. So it's never the same, and it's horrible that anywhere you go, you can find an example of that. It could be, obviously, we don't play in Afghanistan, but I mean that would be an easy target. Go anywhere in America, and you'll find that they're withdrawing reproductive rights or access to advice, access even to Catholic Christian advice that might suggest contraception might be not entirely a bad thing, and really, really fluffy things. But that's in the context of it being funky and driving and loud and rock and rolly, because you don't want to be depressed really by it all, but you want it to be real. A song when I was a teenager that I heard that I really affected me was Kenny Rogers, "Ruby, Don't Take Your Love to Town." I'm not a country and western fan, but that song was a song about a Vietnam War veteran who's paralyzed from the waist down, who can't deliver in the bedroom, whose sexually frustrated wife is going out down the town, obviously to get laid. It's an amazing narrative, and it's an extraordinary story that I'm sure would be censored now or banned now, and no artist would attempt to write a song as real as that. And he was a Republican. He wasn't a lefty commie long hair, was he? He was trying to write real things.
Something different from the gambler.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you ever, I was just thinking when you're saying that, and the point about you can go to these different American states and such, and there's all these different issues with women's rights. I can imagine, even though you'd think that the crowd is there for Gang of Four, that there could occasionally be opposition because of the way America is. Do you ever find that, or?
Well, the most opposition we've had was in this country, to be honest. I mean, there used to be sometimes quite dangerous to be on the stage, especially the Leeds bands, us and the Mekons and Delta 5 were quite often targeted like that. And I think it's quite uncomfortable in those sorts of situations. But no, I haven't noticed that particularly, and I haven't really noticed that in America. But you do get a sense of this really, really divided place, which is more and more like this country, really more and more. And unoriginally, I think this is down to social media, people being in their echo chambers. I rather like being contradicted or I rather like having a debate or a conversation. And a lot of the time, I'm not entirely sure that I'm right about anything particularly. I do know that I'm a socialist. I do know that I generally think we live in a very unfair society and there should be a better distribution of wealth, etc. But it is also, if you just listen to people that you already agree with, you might as well not have a conversation. It is, of course, annoying when people are trying to be a devil's advocate and try and be controversial. But the positions that people are adopting are so extreme and so difficult that I don't know. As I say, go back to your question. No, I hadn't really noticed that in America. What I think our shows is people go along there and they get a great sense of relief of being among people who want to have a fantastic fun time, but also feel that they need to be sort of reassured that there are other people like them. Because especially as now so much of, I'm not on social media at all, but so much of social media has been taken over, like X, for example, absolutely by the extreme right, by fascists and incels and these people. So it's quite difficult, I think, to have a mushy centrist lefty view and find any way to express it. It's quite difficult, I think, except in your friendship group, I suppose. I mean, it's more and more difficult for that. And I think it to be able to go somewhere publicly and say, hey, well, there's another 2,000 people around here, and we all think this, we're kind of in the same mindset. I think it must be great joy.
Yeah. In terms of the juxtaposition between it being so mad that that is still the way it is today, that it was back then in certain respects, it must have been mad in terms of dangerous places to go and dangerous places to play. The early days of New York, and in the book, it's so riveting reading about those early days when you were out there, surrounded by so many artists and ushered into these rooms by journalist Mary Harron. And the idea as well, the craziest thing is that you hitchhiked. Was it that you hitchhiked to the States, or was that Spain, or was that both?
Oh, I hitchhiked everywhere. Yeah, I hitchhiked around in the northeast, the top right hand corner of America. I was 18 then. I mean, I hitchhiked everywhere. I mean, when I was at university in Leeds, I never paid for a bus. I used to get on the entry point of the M1 and I'd hitchhike up to Leeds. It was always quicker than the bus and obviously cheaper. And I've hitchhiked to Amsterdam and down to Spain a few times.
But not just
It
that.
was,
I'm sorry to interrupt. I was going to say not just the fact that, you could zip here, there, and everywhere via hitchhiking, but also the fact that you and Andy were given grants to go out there seems extraordinary.
yeah, well, Andy was in the year below me, and I had one of my tasks was I had to write a long essay about an artist, a subject of my choice. And I said that I would write my thesis about Jasper Johns, the American pop artist. And I needed to see the primary work. I need to do primary research. I need to see it, which is all in New York, which was really, I was being rather slippery because the reason I did that is because I wanted to go to New York and see Velvet Underground and all these other bands. Though I, of course, weren't playing at that point, but I wanted to go along and see Television and the Voidoids and Richard Hell and all this stuff. I got a grant that covered the airfare. And Andy asked if he could come along with me. He was in the year below me. He didn't have to do that, as I describe in the book. He blagged enough money to cover the airfare to do a photographic study of Gothic architecture in northern France by motorcycle, which is really funny because, of course, he obviously was never going to do that because he was going to be in New York. So we went to New York together, and it's hard to describe it with no one had a phone. Mary didn't have a phone. She was a journalist. I didn't have a phone. No one I knew had a phone. So I wrote her a letter, and she wrote that and said, you can come and stay. It was a friend of a friend had introduced us. And she was living in the coolest street in the entire world and unbelievable. St. Mark's Place, H Street. There's a whole book written about it, which I reference. But, round the corner, it was the jazz club where Miles Davis and John Coltrane and Ornette Coleman played, and Andy Warhol had a club a few blocks down, and William Burroughs lived across the road, and Debbie Harry lived 2 blocks away, and the CBGB's was a few blocks away, and it was really seedy. I mean, there's a photograph that I've put in the book. If anyone's been to Manhattan in the last 30 years, you wouldn't imagine that this place where these brownstones are selling for like $3 million, you could rent for $125 a month. But it was really dangerous. I mean, we were a few blocks from what's called Alphabet City, where the roads start having numbers and they have, A, B, C, Ds. One in every 4 houses was a burnt out ruin from arson or crime or whatever. It really was a danger. They'd had 1,000 murders by August of that year in Manhattan. To put it into context, in the whole of Great Britain, that year, they had 100 murders, and in had 1,000. And when you arrived at the airport, they gave some art people gave out this thing with a skull and crossbones on it that said, like a warning: "Do not enter Manhattan." And it was like the John Carpenter movie, Escape from New York.
Yeah, Kurt Russell, yeah.
New Yorkers would have recognised that as being a real thing, and I think a lot of zombie movies are based on what it was like to be down in Greenwich Village there, because you get people really zonked out, junkies and crims homesteading all of the doorwells and things like that. And of course, me and Andy look so rough. I never once felt unsafe. I think because we just looked like we didn't have any money, because we didn't have any money. But Mary was fantastic, and she later became the director of American Psycho. That's amazing.
Which again is like a juxtaposition of the haves and the have-nots, isn't it? Because American Psycho obviously is that, yeah.
Yeah, and that strangeness. I mean, at that time, if you went sort of south of, when they call Soho, south of Houston Street, it was really dangerous. And they had these blocks of areas, a bit like in Judge Dredd, blocks where the bourgeoisie would be. And they were really heavily policed. But the police abandoned the other blocks. I mean, they'd fired about a third of all the cops because knew it went bankrupt. It was like being in a dying animal. And of course, if you're a musician or an artist, the best place to be is in something that's a disaster. Like I always think of that scene in The Third Man when Orson Welles turns to the bloke who's trying to trap him, the detective, and says, "Yes, in the 16th century, you had the Borgias, you had murder, crime, rape, and constant war. And the result was Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael. And then in Switzerland, 500 years of peace. And what do you get? The cuckoo clock." And I think that stuff produced television and the Ramones and Blondie and Talking Heads. And that was what inspired me and Andy. We were there and saw and hung out with those bands before they were famous in some shitty club. And then came back, and punk rock had started over here, which is like a lot of it was like a version of the New York Dolls, and the look, certainly McLaren's band, the Sex Pistols, was totally Richard Hell's look. But it meant it was possible to be an outsider band and play somehow or other. And our great good fortune was the Buzzcocks adopted us. Pete and Steve were really, really good to us. And, we used to sleep on Pete Shelley's floor of his house, if we were in Manchester. And then our friends, our management we shared an office with the Slits and the pop group. And the Slits were my favourite band, and we played a lot with them, and they were just a fantastically brilliant band.
That thing about them just being like normal people as well. I swear it was in Paul Hanley's book from the fall that they loved the Buzzcocks, or rather they loved Buzzcocks, and they found out the drummer lived down the road or whatever, and they knocked on, and he was just a normal bloke, and he said, "Yeah, pop in if you like," and that normal aspect to everyone. Like I'm sure if someone saw you in Bath, they might find it crazy that you're just a normal bloke, etc. But yeah, it does seem mad, that, doesn't it?
Yeah. What was very amazing about the Buzzcocks was Pete was very much obviously he said to us, "Trouble with you lot, there's too many chiefs and not enough Indians," and which is probably right because we argued all the time. But they had no, they weren't protective about themselves. Like when we did our first ever European tour was with support of the Buzzcocks, and our second ever tour was supporting the Buzzcocks and playing our own shows around the States. And in like the 30 days that we played about 45 times, I think, because we played doubles. So we go on at 10 and we go on and go on again at midnight. So we'd be playing like two shows a night, except when we played with the Buzzcocks, we'd only play one show a night. So we play, yeah, three shows every 2 days kind of thing. And we got better and better and better. I think the issue back then with the Buzzcocks was they very much it was very song based and it wasn't performance based. You got to try and get a balance of the two, I think. So by the end, we were like a kind of mad juggernaut. And we still do that now, barely pause for breath between songs. There's no shoegazing.
With the book To Hell with Poverty, I thought it was interesting that it came pretty much about because of bumping into Steve Diggle and him suggesting, why not write the memoir? Did it feel like kind of a full circle moment, having that bump, considering, you hit the ground running so much off the back of touring with them?
Yes, I think that's a good point. I mean, it's a very good point. I mean, really, I hadn't thought about doing anything like this. It was great bumping into him. We were both at Abbey Road Studios being interviewed for some documentary, bumped into each other in the cafe, and I was really pleased to see him, but I was even more pleased that he sort of kind of even recognised me, even though we played about 60 times with him. You never think that anyone would pay much attention. He was really pleased to see me and very much said, "Oh, you ought to do it, man." Yeah, it is a circular thing, and I think that's a motif when on the memoir thing, which I worked really hard to do. Was at first I thought I wouldn't remember very much. The idea of writing 80,000 words. In the end, I wrote 84,000 words, but I think I could have written 200,000 words, and I came to the end to think, oh, there's lots of things I didn't include or didn't elaborate on or thought, oh, I wish I'd included that story. Like, I'd forgotten to put in like Cromer House just as an afterthought. That Cromer House, where I had a flat with Andy Corrigan and Mark White of the Mekons, and it was the centre of the sort of Leeds bunch where we all assembled. I forgot to say that it's a funny gag that it's now a careers advisory centre. That sort of thing I found quite funny, and I found those little codas at the end where I'd say, we play the Rat Club in Boston, which is now Ramada Inn or something, or the Workhouse in the Old Kent Road burnt down and is now a Tesco's or something, and there seemed to be sort of some sort of karma in there. Everything you thought would be turn the world into a bland desert of commerce has come true. It somehow, you know.
It's like at the end of our road, I'm fairly certain there's like a Brewers Fair or one of these pub chains, and I'm fairly certain it was like this venue where like Hendrix played and stuff.
Yeah.
And like you say, now it's just somewhere where you can get a cheap pint as you get onto the motorway, and it's depressing.
Yeah, it's curious. It is a totally different world, and these things do go round and round in circles. And we're in a I don't know where we're at the moment in this mandala, but it's strange. Yeah.
So you saying just then about there was so much, that you could have even kept in or that you'd forgotten. I personally, so I loved the whole book. I really did think it was great, and I like the fact that there were these little add-ons and such, the coders, like you say, but also in the fact that like sometimes there were just tiny little snippets of story, and that was it, and it kept you, leafing through the book. With the tour stories, like when you were out in the States, and sometimes it was going great, sometimes it was going dreadfully. I was so swept up in that energy of how everything was at the time. Was there so much more that you could have included from that you have looked back on, or was it a case of trying to just condense it to those sort of moments?
Well, some of the things I put in, the lawyer took out.
Right.
I mentioned that we used to bribe our way into first class on airplanes. But when I first wrote it, I named our long dead travel agent and I named the company that we had that was our travel agent that went bust like about 30, but the lawyer said, no, you can't name them. I said, but he's dead. And the company said, no, no, but someone might own the name. So some things are taken out for those reasons. And then others I thought, because they're so crazy. Like, I mentioned we'd go on a tour bus. Once we went around America, we all drove ourselves in big muscle cars. We'd hired these old things, kind of like, was it the gumball race? Trying to get quickly as we could from gig to gig. Not exactly racing, but kind of. And then there were sort of things that were really, what I didn't want to do was talk ill of my old friends. By the end of last few decades, me and Andy were not on speaking terms, but at that time we were best friends. So I wanted to write it like we felt at the time. I didn't want to get any of the, late stage invective in to that. And I saw Paul McCartney before Christmas in concert for the first time in my life. I was really moved by it, and he was very kind about and warm and loving about John Lennon and George Harrison because it was about when they were brothers. So what I didn't want to do, and there were lots of things that were really, really bad that happened, and I didn't want to describe them because it might look I was being snarky and difficult. I suppose you could have written a different thing. I wanted it to be really zippy and breezy and, like you say, short stories because I'd read quite a few autobiographies when I in my research phase. My favourite one was Elton John's ghost-written one. I really enjoyed that. But my least favourite was Bernie Taupin's thing, Elton John's partner. I don't know if you've read that one. It's really boring because you'd think this man who was one of the greatest lyricists of the last 50 years, all he did was go to bars and get drunk with famous people. And you think, hey, you surely must have done something interesting with your time other than drink with really famous people. One day I'm in Los Angeles and the next day I'm in somewhere else. And I think that's boring about band things. I mean, I enjoyed the one about The Fall, for example, the narrative about them, because you get a sense of the crazy dynamic of being around Mark, who I knew quite well. So what wanted to convey over was there's an incredible fun about being in a band, but it's really not like normal life. It's not. It's a really odd thing to do, especially for us. I just wanted to change the world. Which sounds obviously it's grandiose and pompous, but that's what I really, really wanted to do. That I didn't want to be in a band. I wanted to change the world. I wanted to fight for justice somehow or other. I saw recently the movie about Bob Dylan, and you think of someone like Woody Guthrie, what an incredible man. This machine kills fascists on his guitar, and that his machine did kill fascists. I mean, the power of a song. This land is your land, and so yeah. I mean, and Bob Dylan when he wrote things like the times they are changing. It helped the times to change, or a change is going to come by Sam Cooke. You think, man, that songs can change the world. Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday. They can do that. And of course, Miles Davis's trumpet. And Jimi Hendrix's guitar, or Nirvana's big Beatles-esque chords. They can make you imagine the world's a better place and enjoy it more.
It's interesting you say that as well about the Dylan film because I'm sure she won't mind me saying this, but my partner shed a tear during Times They Are Changing because she didn't know that song and where it came from. She probably only saw the advert that was for British Telecom or something that had the song playing over it, and she didn't realize that there was so much, power and
grace.
Yeah, and responsibility behind it from this young guy. And yeah, I thought that was really quite powerful.
I was quite overwhelmed by that film because Bob Dylan going electric. When I was 11, I heard Highway 61 Revisited. I have it on behind me in my studio. I'm not in my studio at the moment, but I have it sitting up there to remind me not to be a flake. I felt quite melancholic after seeing the film thinking that maybe I'd squandered my gifts and that Bob had made me a promise. People underrate young people, young teenagers alike. They make decisions about stuff that is significant and powerful. And I thought that is, and we didn't have a record player at home. We only had a 78. My parents didn't listen to music at all. And I heard this stuff and it changed my life. And like you're saying about your partner, those songs are so powerful. And to me, hearing God said to Abraham, kill me a son, Abe said, man, you must be putting on that. Highway 61 Revisited is just, that track is a masterpiece. And then, of course, Like a Rolling Stone, I think it's the track before it. It's the promise that you can change the world with a song. I think it was Joan Baez, I may be wrong, that wrote We Shall Overcome. It sounds like a spiritual from the 19th century, but I think it was written like in the late 50s or the early 60s. And that makes you want to cry. I mentioned Paul, I started weeping. A friend was his music director, so I got very good seats. And so I was at the side of the stage. I think, oh, well, I'm amazed I've never seen Paul and playing Let It Be. And because that song is all about forgiving yourself. And I was sort of astounded that I was so, because I'm not very emotional. I was just overwhelmed by it. And I thought, God, that's a hell of a song. Yeah, it's a hell of a song.
That whole record, in fact, because I was always, sometimes you like the zippy stuff, don't you? Or you like the rocky stuff. And I always thought like, Long and Winding Road,
Oh, yeah.
it's always a skipper. But like in the past few years, that record's like you get a lump in the throat sometimes, don't you?
Well, I play the piano, and that was one of the pieces that I learned to play with quite a nice arrangement. And I actually had to stop playing. I often found myself starting to blub because, of course, you bring your own meaning to great songs, don't you? I mean, that's why so many songs, even corny songs like Yesterday, which I don't really like that song, but that's been covered, I don't know, 1,000 times probably, because people bring their own investment to it. I think why, for example, Damaged Goods has been covered quite often because people get the attempt to be emotionally honest.
Yeah, yeah.
They sort of get that. I mean, because we're all most of the time emotionally dishonest, and I think that's probably why it still seems to be attractive. And although at the moment, my 32-year-old daughter sent me a text message at 5:45 a.m. in the morning on a Sunday morning at some club. They're playing To Hell with Poverty. It was a floor filler at 5:45 a.m. I was thinking, oh, I've done something right.
That's funny, saying about it made you consider the Dylan aspect and, maybe you'd squandered some gifts perhaps, but that must have made you feel good to have 2025 or if it was 2024, your daughter sending you something like that.
It was about 6 weeks ago. Yeah, no, that was, yeah. And I think the trouble with Bob Dylan is it sets too high a bar. I think there's some things. It's like the Great American Songbook. If you actually wanted, I'm not a very good pianist, but if you actually were someone who wanted to make a living writing songs that have complicated and beautiful key changes, it's really, really hard. When you've got songs like My Funny Valentine on there and you think, oh no, the bar is so high. Comparing yourself to that is not really being fair on yourself. Like I think anyone comparing themselves to Bob Dylan would fall, would fail, really. That's such a great record. And Blonde on Blonde, of course. Blonde on Blonde, where he's in electrical failure that affected the whole of Manhattan. It was quite famous. All of the lights went out for several hours in Manhattan in the 60s. I only know by reading about it. And Bob Dylan, of course, he's sitting there and he writes immediately an amazing song about it because you can write songs about anything. That was something that really impressed me. So when I came to write Cheeseburger on the second album, it's because Andy and I had been playing pool with a couple of drunken truckers in a truck stop, a pool hall. I think they thought they were sharks, but they weren't that good. And we won about $100 off them playing, Winner Stays On and put money on it. But all of the lyrics are just I move from one place to the next. I hope they keep down the price of gas. I shoot the best. Are we talking dollars? You know, I was sort of mentally sort of like writing down everything they said. And that of course, is the song. And that's something that I think I definitely took away from Bob. One of my piano teachers gave me a cassette tape that his son was an aspiring songwriter and asked me to comment on it, which is really, I don't like to do because I don't want to be unkind to people necessarily. And I listened to it, and it sounded really nice, but it wasn't about anything. And I said, this is the corny thing. Can't you write about something you know about rather than something that sounds like something else? And he said, well, what can I write about? And I said, well, you've just taken your glasses off, haven't you? And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, you've just taken your glasses off to think about me. So there's your opening line. He took his glasses off to tell me what he thought, like Joni Mitchell would do. The last time I saw Richard was Detroit in 1968, and he told me all romantics come to the same fate, suddenly cynical and drunk and boring someone in some dark cafe. Or look out the left, the captain said, down there is where we're going to land. You think someone actually said that? Joni Mitchell, I'm sure she was on a plane, and over the intercom it said, look out the left, down there's where we're going to land. Okay, there's a song kicking it off.
With that sort of thing, you obviously see it in the film, the Dylan film, but when you get a line or similar, you haven't got a notes app in the 70s. So what do you do, or more,
Yeah. I had a little notebook with me the whole time.
right.
I now, on my phone, I just, on the notes bit,
Yeah.
I write down little sentences that I think as I go along. What did I write down today? Oh, yeah. There was a Latin phrase, the corruption of the best is the worst. And I think, oh, that's an interesting line. They're just zillions and zillions of little sentences that don't necessarily make any sense. Dog food online, I wrote yesterday. I don't know.
The new album from Gang of Four. Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
I used to write out song titles because Andy didn't like having a song without a song title. It's a bit like Mick Jagger and Keith. So I used to have a whole page of song titles. I think I've got a page reproduced in the book somewhere there. I wanted to call an album, which Andy rejected, The Idea of Switzerland. And that was, in fact, it turned into Songs of the Free. But The Idea of Switzerland, to me, been interesting because I'd read that, the reason that you have green in so many Arab flags is because paradise is green from these parched desert countries. So I thought that was quite interesting. And that Switzerland, with its mountains and peaks and trees and all that kind of stuff, is particularly there. So the idea of Switzerland as paradise just seemed really interesting to me because I don't. Switzerland's a highly mechanized, efficient watchmaking country, isn't it? It's not my idea of heaven. My idea of heaven would be a bit scruffier than that.
But the image on the Toblerone is inviting.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you bring up the Songs of the Free record, and I must admit I am a massive fan of that record. I think it's great. A lot of people do just stick with the first two, perhaps, but I really love that record, and I must admit I Love a Man in a Uniform is a house favorite. It's just so catchy, but so Gang of Four as well. Was there any truth to it potentially being used, I read, by the US Army for a recruitment campaign, that song?
No, what it's funny how things have their own momentum. At some point, I heard that our publisher was approached by, I think it was the US Air Force, about possibly using the song for a recruitment campaign. I would have said no, obviously. But it never went anywhere. It never got to the point of coming to the band to even ask us whether we did or didn't want to reject it. I rejected almost any use of any of our songs on anything. So I was quite stubborn about that. I didn't want that to happen very much, which is why then you don't see them on adverts for sausages and things like that. But I always mentally imagined the scene, when the guy's saying, "Sir, we've got this really great thing. It's I love a man in a uniform. It says everything we want to do about this," and then thinking about it, and then someone else coming and saying, this is a really big hit in the gay clubs of." It was a really big gay record, and I think they would have sort of balked at that, and then maybe twigged it wasn't entirely about signing up. But of course, that was banned in Britain. That and At Home is a Tourist. So we had two singles banned. And I thought Uniform, Andy and I wrote that one to, in a conventional, it's got a dominant, subdominant, tonic, chord change, key change, double chorus out kind of thing. We did write it to write a pop song that might get played because our music just didn't get played at all. After a while, it becomes quite, as I describe in the book, after a while you're a successful band, but you're sort of treading water. You can't get out of playing the same venue. I think we must have played one venue in New York like 7 times. I mean, it was these like 2,000 capacity venues, but each time we came back, we played always the same one because you couldn't get out of that without a hit record because the next size room was like 5,000. We just couldn't sell the tickets for it. So over here, it was doing really, really well. But then the Falkland Islands happened. It was interesting to me. When it was banned, we were doing a short while afterwards, sort of licking our wounds. We were doing, I think, an old grey whistle test show and bumped into one of the backing singers, Stevie Langer, at the BBC thing. And she was wearing a red coat uniform, an 18th century thing. And I said, "Oh, how are you doing, Stevie? What are you up to?" And she was doing, I think it was something like a Lena Zavaroni Christmas special, this was in August, but so they film it well in advance. And I said, "Yeah, well, what are you doing then?" She said, "We're doing a medley of Second World War Vera Lynn songs, like White Cliffs of Dover and things." And I said, "Yeah, so why are you wearing a red coat outfit?" And she said, "Because they weren't going to be in uniform because it was too sensitive." So to get an idea of the sort of, it's not exactly censorship, but it kind of is. And I think a lot of that is happening now with people wanting to sort of bite their tongues about not wanting to put their heads above the parapet for obvious reasons. It's quite troubling. Again, why do people care about music that we made 30 years ago? It's because, again, that song, "I Love a Man in a Uniform." If you write outside of music and you write about things that are about masculinity and about that blah blah blah, they're dangerous. But that's their appeal. I mean, the appeal to me of Bob Dylan was it was dangerous. That's why I'm really proud, really, to have done something that still has danger in it. Like I said, Guns Before Butter is a dangerous song. In that, it's dangerous to describe the world as it is. I've got some. Oh, you said about holding up something to the screen. My artwork I'm selling, it's a print. This is called A Brief History of the 20th Century. And on the left-hand side is a 1940 French franc. It says, as a national slogan of France, "Liberty, equality, fraternity" in French. And here is a 1942 franc, and it's changed to "Work, Family, Country." So democracy, hard right, fascist ideas. And I thought that's why I've done this, as I'm doing these artworks connected with not necessarily connected with the tour, but about the times that we're in. Because if we're all going to get through this thing, it's going to be through culture and art. It's got to be making great music and making great pictures and being kind to each other, I think.
I appreciate we've got, a couple of minutes left. And as much as I really want to talk, and I really do want to talk about the song that you did for the Karate Kid, I think it would make more sense to pivot to something else, although that would make more sense for me. But I just wanted to touch on, the book itself and what you've said previously during this interview, that you didn't want to put a slight on the relationship between you and Andy so much, and you wanted to focus less on the later years and, the not talking and what have you. There was something interesting I read recently, rather, that a point you made about when he did branch off and do Gang of Four solo. And I remember seeing Gang of Four at a Six Music Fest a while back, and I wasn't privy to all this, with the switching and going solo and such. What was the thought process for you with all that? Not to end on a downer so much, but what was the thinking behind that and the going solo with Gang of Four?
Well, he and I had really, really seriously fallen out, and there were all sorts of really serious issues that we fundamentally disagreed about. And also, he was an alcoholic by then, and his drinking was out of control. Like drinking like 4 or 5 bottles of wine a night, that kind of thing. It was really difficult. It was impossible, really, for our two characters to be in that. And I don't know if you've ever worked with someone with those alcohol abuse problems. It's really difficult, or addiction problems. So there was that, and I wanted to fold the band. I just said, let's just stop. This was like 2011. We actually did quite a lot of legal exchanges, but because we were jointly owned the band, he decided to carry on, and I was really really pissed off about it, And I said, well, you wouldn't get the Smiths going out with Johnny Marr as the Smiths, or Morrissey as the Smiths, or you wouldn't get the Who just with Pete Townsend without Roger Daltrey, or Oasis wouldn't go out with either of the Gallagher brothers. They go out as BDI and whatever, or Led Zeppelin. And it's not unknown for singers and guitarists to fall out with each other. In fact, it's more normal than not. And of course, I wrote all the words. I mean, so I said, these are my words, and I don't want to diss his sidemen, but I mean, they were just sort of, it's like a pickup band. And when I got back together with Hugo, because Hugo and me and Andy, the three of us founded the band, and I had hoped for a reconciliation with Andy, but then when I did the box set, during the making of the box set, which I worked really hard on and made sure, I don't know if you've actually seen it, it was only available in the US, but I made sure that it really reflected the four of us equally. It wasn't about me, the four of us when we were brothers. What I heard, rather like you, I saw interviews where he'd say things like, it was all about me, basically. And I was thinking, well, it wasn't really. But I don't want to be, and this thing, I didn't want to be snarky and point scoring. I finished in 1984. At that point, and he was still what I would have called more or less an alcoholic, but not too bad, but very seriously ill. He had testicular cancer. It had all gone south. Our manager had stolen all our money. It's kind of brilliantly operatic. And then we got the gig. We were completely broke. I only had like $200, and then got a job writing a song on the Karate Kid, which is really funny. I mean, like, we got sent two scripts. One was for a Latino kid falls in love with a WASP girl in Los Angeles, and the white guy's really racist and challenge him to a kung fu fight, which is, I mean, really bonkers. And he learns to become a comfort expert by painting fences and polishing cars. Obviously, he'd seen Rome, Open City by Vittorio De Sica, and this it was a comically absurd story. We also got sent at the same time another movie script, which we turned down because we could only do one. Really fit welder girl in Pittsburgh who becomes a dancer and goes to the Juilliard School of Music, which became Flashdance, which we turned down because Karate Kid scripts seemed more realistic. But when you write these things, I did quite a few of them after that. They say things like, "Oh, well, we'd like the music to be like sad, but also happy. And could you do it in like a minor key and a major key at the same time? We're really seeing it as being upbeat, but kind of slow." You go, "Oh, all right. Yeah. So slow and quick, upbeat, but sad." This one was music in the background when they were declaring their love in a car or something like that. I don't know. And it had to sound like an AOR track coming out of the radio. Now, of course, going on to current affairs, that would be done by AI. I have no doubt that sort of thing, which is a kind of bread and butter thing that keeps people alive, I have no doubt that would be done by AI, because all you do actually now, if you'd like to write a Gang of Four song, you just have to ask it to write a song like that. I was one of the 1,000 artists who, by the way, who co-wrote the album that came out 6 weeks ago. I did nothing but put my name to the list because AI is destroying the livelihoods of everyone to give money to American tech heads. Karate Kid was funny. It's a good film as well. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, yeah. I loved finding out about it in the research, and then I trawled the internet for it. And a lot of people were just saying, I don't even know where it is in the film. And I watched it again recently, and I was just thinking, where is it? And I think it's when he's...
They're in the car.
Oh, it's in the car, right. Okay.
They're driving along and it's on the radio in the background. Like you, I couldn't actually remember how it went. I got the soundtrack album and I listened to it. And then actually...
It's good.
The lyrics it's quite good.
It's really good.
Quite a good song. And I completely... I don't remember all of the things I've written, but I had forgotten that one. I thought, oh, that's not bad. Because, you sort of think, oh, knock something out. and used a keyboard on that one as well. I wrote that one, so there's no guitar on it at all.
Worried that you were squandering your gift, John, but there you go.
Yeah, I paid the mortgage.